This is Mike Crimmins. I'm a climatologist with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension, focusing on agriculture and natural resources management. I've been working with rangeland managers in the Southwest for the past 15 years. This video will provide a more in-depth look at some of the features in myRAINge log, a tool for helping to monitor precipitation on rangelands. Precipitation monitoring is a key rangeland management tool. In a collaborative drought planning project we did with ranchers and land managers back in 2015, we heard that more rain gauges in key areas would help with monitoring for drought impacts and triggering management decisions. Simple, capped PVC gauges that measure cumulative precipitation over time can be effective rain gauges at remote locations. Cumulative precipitation observations can be collected at any time interval, and gauges are often read during annual vegetation monitoring events at key sites. University of Arizona Cooperative Extension has been working with ranchers and land managers to develop best practices in constructing, placing, and reading rain gauges, and managing and utilizing these observations. myRAINge log was co-developed with these partners and designed specifically to support the collection, management, and interpretation of cumulative precipitation observations at remote sites. Again, cumulative precipitation monitoring is different than typical daily monitoring where gauges are read and emptied. Cumulative gauges are set up each season with some antifreeze to prevent the gauge from cracking and a thin amount of oil to prevent evaporation. The gauge is then left out to collect rain throughout the season. The gauge can then be read multiple times without emptying. Each reading is then higher than the previous, representing the cumulative total through the season. Here's an example where a gauge was emptied or zeroed out on June 15th before the summer rainy season here in Arizona. The gauge was then read 5 times throughout the summer to track cumulative precipitation. The reference climatology lines representing the different percentiles were generated from historical daily PRISM precipitation data for this site. myRAINge log was developed to accommodate these types of observations and generates reference climatologies for each gauge location. The main features of myRAINge log include a main dashboard with information and access to all gauges registered with your account or shared with you, a gauge summary page with site information and all recent observations, a detailed report with cumulative precipitation observations, a reference climatology based on historical gridded precipitation estimates, and near real-time precipitation estimates from the PRISM dataset, a map to access all other gauges with public observations and to generate reports, and all pages and features are smartphone ready and work offline. After setting up an account, you can add as many gauges as desired to this single account. On the Gauges dashboard, click Add Gauge. This will pull up the Add Gauge interface. Here you will describe your gauge by adding its name and photo if desired, the location either by clicking on the map or entering the lat long directly, and a site description if desired. You can also set the gauge to private or share your observations through the public mapping interface. Finally, you need to enter the first observation for this gauge, so subsequent observations will be cumulative totals. Typically, this is 0 if the gauge was empty. All subsequent readings will be added to this initial reading to calculate cumulative totals. Here's an example with all information entered for the gauge. When all information is correct, click Add Gauge. A confirmation message will be displayed on the screen. The new gauge will show up on your main gauge dashboard. Clicking on the gauge will bring up its own page. Edits to any of the gauge metadata can be made by clicking on the settings icon and then edit. Adding an observation to a gauge is done by clicking on the plus button in the gauge tile or the Get Started if this is the first observation for the gauge. On the Add Observation page, enter the date of the observation, the amount read in the gauge, any site observations, and a photo of the site if desired. Click Save Log and the observation is committed to the database. New observations will immediately show up in the log on the left-hand side of the gauge page. To generate a report, click on the View Report button from any gauge summary page. This can also be done from the public map page by clicking on any gauge and then the View Report button. The report defaults to the last 365 days, but can be adjusted to any time period, but no longer than 365 days. The date in this report was adjusted to June 1st through March 1st. The chart shows the actual observations as black circles and the daily prism estimates for the gauge location as a blue line. Clicking on either line will bring up an information bubble that displays comparative values between observed and estimated amounts. Here, the cumulative amount observed in the gauge on October 2nd was 0.78 inches, which is substantially lower than the amount of 1.67 inches estimated by the interpolated value for that location from the PRISM precipitation dataset. The reference climatology is based on all cumulative precipitation amounts for the specified time period from the PRISM dataset for that gauge location. This means that cumulative precipitation amounts estimated at this gauge location for all years from 1981 to present are organized into percentiles. The most typical cumulative amounts in the historical record are near the 50th percentile, or the median, while the rarest amounts are towards the extremes, like the 2nd percentile on the low end of values and 98th percentile on the high end. These regions are color-coded and labeled to quickly assess how both observed and estimated values compare to the historical estimates at this location. Comparisons of observations from previous years or with other gauges can also be added to the report. Here, the observed and estimated values from 2 years ago are added in comparison to current observations. Each report has a gauge location map and table of logged observations, including any notes and photos entered. These are collapsed at the bottom of the report page, but can be expanded by clicking on the arrows. Reports can also be generated in a printer-friendly format and shared directly with others through a custom link. Thanks for your interest in myRAINge blog. You can find the tool at this URL and can contact me, Mike Crimmins, at this email with any questions or suggestions.